The most dramatic inflation bubble in the United Nations is still ongoing. Have you ever thought about what will happen if the bubble bursts? Series of incidents surely from economic differences up to wars can take place. How about we take you through the amazing yet astonishing journey of the US's attempt to control inflation in 2022? Inflation occurs when spending on interests and benefits outstrips generation. Taxes can rise because of inflation limitations that boost the cost of manufacturing goods and offering services, or because clients, appreciating the advantages of a flourishing economy, spend their additional cash more rapidly than makers can increase creativity. Inflation is often the outcome of some variety of these two schemes. Hey there, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to turn on the bell notifications because what you receive here is completely free. Before we begin, let us ask you a question. How have you been economically? If you're not in the US, would you feel happy about the dollar's value getting depleted? Well, the dollar is the global currency as of now, regardless of the fact that Bitcoin had been in the talk about coming to the new global reserve. But the same seems technically a bit more formidable to achieve. Moving on to that other aspect, the value of the US dollar getting depleted is no good for anyone. For instance, if you're trading or even selling your services to international clients, they will send you in dollars. So, in case the dollar is getting devalued, your income cash is going to get low, extremely low. Taking this point into consideration, at least as a side one, the US intends to list down policies and achievements to control inflation. Now, there is another reason as to why they need to do it. America is suffering from a pressing inflation issue, moving the country into a state of extreme economic crisis. Have you ever thought about how the US dollar will influence us as subjects of worldwide relations? You don't have to be immediately linked to the US by any means. Even as countries, individuals will endure. Inflation in the US is at its peak, which is why the country is focusing on regulating the same. In the States, the financial control is with the federal government. The issue arises because the authority has to keep on printing physical money in order to meet the global demands. However, the same directly intervenes with the restriction of the country's internal monetary strategies. Despite the favorable emotions, it's crucial to remember that US inflation is being moderated in part due to a statistical anomaly known as base effects. The 12-month figures are correlated to prices from a year ago when inflation was at its apex. In other words, existing inflation happens to be slightly better than year-ago inflation. Consumers in the United States will nevertheless find it a fascinating relief. It's important to realize that today's figures don't indicate that inflation is lessening. Rather, they indicate that price increases have reached a provisional halt. To say that inflation has peaked would take more than a month of reduced CPI statistics. Moderating oil prices had an impact on the April CPI data in addition to these base effects. The Russian incursion of Ukraine in February aided in the rise of crude prices, which reached around $140 per barrel at one time. It also has heightened the slowdown in the global economy, which is attaining what could become a digressive period of unstable growth and boosted inflation, depending on the World Bank's latest Global Economic Prospects report. In January, it was foreseen that global growth is expected to decline from 5.1% in 2021 to 2.9% in 2022, which is evidently lower than 4.1%. It is predicted to hover around that pace over 2023 to 24 as the war in Ukraine disrupts work, investment and business in the near period pent-up needs fades, and fiscal and monetary policy concession is relinquished. The level of per capita revenue in developing economies this year will be nearly 5% higher than the pre-pandemic trend as a result of deterioration from pandemic and war. World Bank President David Malpass said the reasons for the disturbance in growth are the Ukrainian wars, supply chain disruptions, lockdowns in China, and the risk of stagflation. He also added that a recession would be hard to stave off for many countries. He went on by telling the markets to look ahead, and it's very urgent to have the encouragement of products to avoid trade restrictions. Modifications in fiscal, economic, climate, and debt strategy are needed to answer capital misallocation and unevenness. The reports of the June Global Economic Prospects state that the first systematic appraisal of how current global economic conditions compare with the stagflation of the 1970s, with a specific emphasis on how stagflation could influence rising markets and evolving economies. Abrupt increases in interest values in major advanced economies that played a crucial role in accelerating a thread of financial hardships in emerging markets, and evolving countries assisted in the comeback from the stagflation end of the 1970s. Ahan Koz, the director of World Bank Prospect, made a statement by saying that balance is needed in the developing economies to assure physical sustainability, with the urgent need to satisfy the effects of today's existing side-by-side crisis on the neediest citizens. He went on to say that conveying monetary policy decisions, leveraging adequate monetary policy receptacles, and protecting central bank independence can effectively fix inflation goals and curtail the amount of strategy tightening needed to achieve the desired consequences on inflation and activity. The 1970s resembles the current juncture in three aspects: the lasting supply-side disturbances fueling inflation, foregone by a digressive period of highly generous monetary policy in major progressive economies, possibilities for weakening development and susceptibility that emerging market and developing economies may face concerning the monetary policy tightening that will be required to rein inflation. Nonetheless, the ongoing chapter also erases from the 1970s in many dimensions. Compared to its severe weakness in the 1970s in today's world, the dollar is strong in a sharp contrast to the 1970s. The percentage appraisal in commodity prices is relatively smaller. The balance sheet owned by major financial organizations is strong enough. In contrast to the 1970s, the central banks in progressive economies and developing economies now have clearer statutes for the price resilience, and over the past 3 decades, they have ascertained a plausible track record of attaining their inflation targets. Global inflation is anticipated to lessen next year, but it will likely stay above inflation targets in many frugal. The report points out that if inflation continues to stay high, a repetition of the outcome of the earlier stagflation episode could result in a sharp global downturn, along with financial situations in some emerging markets and emerging economies. Through the report, we also get fresh insights on how the war impacts the energy markets that are fogging over the global growth outlook. The energy-related commodities have also seen a great rise in prices across a wide range due to the Ukrainian war. Higher energy rates will reduce real earnings, lift production expenses, pull financial conditions, and constrain macroeconomic strategy, especially in energy-importing countries. Development in progressive economies is cast to sharply decelerate from 5.1% in 2021 to 2.6% in 2022, 1.2 percentage points below forecasts in January. Growth is anticipated to further normalize to 2.2% in 2023, greatly indicating the further unwinding of the fiscal and monetary policy backing provided during the pandemic. The report brings out the need for definitive global and national policy action to avoid the worst outcomes of the war in Ukraine for the global thrift. This will pertain to global efforts to restrict the harm to those influenced by the war, ease the blow from rising oil and food prices, speed up debt assistance, and broaden vaccinations in low-income nations. It will also involve active supply responses at the national level while conserving global commodity markets working well. Policymakers, besides, should abstain from distortionary strategies such as price controls, pensions, and export vetoes, which could exacerbate the recent boost in commodity prices. Against the demanding surroundings of higher inflation, vulnerable growth, tighter financial circumstances, and limited fiscal policy space, administrations will require to prioritize spending towards targeted relief for susceptible communities. While the nationwide allowance deficit rose every year under President Trump, in part due to an irrational and outstanding $2 trillion tax cut aiding the affluent Americans and biggest firms, the shortage fell by $350 billion in President Biden's early year in office because he prioritized renovating the economy from the bottom up and the middle out. And the depletion is now on track to fall by another $1.5 trillion this year. This courses to households because one of the main ways Congress and the administrative branch can act to reduce price tension is to reduce the nationwide budget shortage. President Biden's plan will make the prosperous Americans and largest associations spend their reasonable share, encompassing a new billionaire's minimum income tax. By authorizing reforms to make firms and the wealthiest Americans pay their fair share, Congress can reduce the deficit even more while also reducing expenses for families. Therefore, now you know what inflation is and consequently all the repressive measures to control inflation. Hit like, comment, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more related videos.